So now we can start adding our enemy to the game, and I have just added some new sprites for the enemy. If you look here, there is a folder called enemy in my sprites folder, and this folder just contains a new sprite sheet for another character like our player. And I downloaded this character from the same page as I downloaded this sprite from, and you can still find that link in the description below. We will need to create some animations for our enemy, so it's not all of these sprites we'll be using, because in this tutorial we will implement a run animation, a an idle animation, and a death animation, and then 2 attack animations, one for attacking with the sword and another one for attacking with the throwing knife. But let's start with the actual idle animation and the run animation, so we can have the enemy idling and then making him start to walk or run later. So first of all, we will have to create the idle animation. So inside the sprite folder with the enemy, you'll have to scroll down and find your idle animation. And of course you can also use the same sprites as you have for the player. Then you'll simply just have 2 characters that looks identical. So select all your idle sprites and drag them into the scene. Oh, I'm missing one out, I can see here. There we go. And then name your animation enemy idle. It's very important you call it enemy idle and not just idle, because I think if you named it the same way as I did, that your player idle should have the same name, be named idle. So there we go. Now we created a new what is called a controller, animation controller, and we will need to keep this animation controller, or actually we will need to use the player's animation controller and copy it. So just delete the animation controller and then find your animation, enemy idle, and throw it into the animations folder here. To make it easier for yourself, you might as well go to the animations folder, right click, create a new folder and call it player, and then take all the animations for the player and put them in there, and then make a new folder and call it enemy, and take the enemy animation and put it in there. So now we have better organization of our animations. So the next thing we'll have to do is to create a walk animation for our enemy. So go back to sprites, find the enemy and find the walk or run or whatever it's called. It is. It's called run here. So just select all your run animations, all your run frames, drag them into the scene and call it enemy run. And delete the controller. And then you just have to find the animation clip here and then drag it into your enemy folder. There we go. And that's basically what we are going to do now. So now we have an enemy idle and an enemy run. Okay, so now that we have the animations, we can go to our scene. If you zoom out, there should be some enemies somewhere. There's a run and an idle. Basically, you can take and delete the run and then take the idle and move him up on top here. And this idle we can actually just rename to enemy. There we go. So now we have an enemy and a player. Besides the animations, we'll also need to create a controller for our enemy, because remember that the controller is what drives our animations. So we will need that controller to drive the animations for our enemy. And basically our enemy is going to have a lot of the same animations as our player. So basically we can just take the player controller and duplicate it and then make it fit our enemy. If we do that, then we don't have to set up all the parameters and all the layers and everything again. So go to the controllers folder, and apparently I have a test one here, just delete it. And then find the player controller and press Ctrl D to duplicate it, or right click on it, and I think there should also be able to duplicate somewhere. Actually you can't do that, so you need to click on it and press Ctrl D to duplicate. So this controller is called player controller 1, and we need to rename it, so press F2 and call it enemy controller. So there we have our enemy controller and our player controller. If we open up our enemy controller, we'll see we have our idle states and we also have our action states. Right now, our enemy will not be able to slide and throw something. Maybe we'll add slide. I'm not sure if we're ever going to add slide. I am actually going to delete the things that we don't need, but you can leave them there if you think that you're going to implement these things later. If we decide to implement it later, we can always move it back and add it. But I would like to keep this as clean as possible. So we need run, we need attack, and we need throw. So basically delete the slide here. Just delete it. And then we will have to go to the air layer. And basically we are not going to have any jumping functionality in our enemy. So basically just right click on the air layer and delete it. So this leaves the idle states for our what's called our enemy, and it leaves our what are they called, our action states here. If we go back to the idle states, we will see that we have two idle states. We have a normal idle and an idle sleep, and basically we are just going to have one idle for our enemy. So we can delete the idle sleep here by simply just clicking on it and deleting it. Okay, so let's see, what do we have here? We have something with speed and we have attack and throw. That's fine. So all these are fine to keep. We don't need to change them right now. Okay, so we will need to add this controller to our enemy. So select the enemy, and when you have selected the enemy, you can take this, look at the animator, and there is a controller spot. So take the enemy controller and throw it up here. When you've done that, you can play your game, and you'll notice that he actually plays the player idle animation here. And that's not what we want. We want him to play our what is called our enemy idle animation, of course. So jump back into your controller, make sure you have your enemy selected, click on the idle here, and you'll see that there's a motion. And this motion is called idle, which is the player's idle function. So you can click on the little radio button in the side here to open up all the assets with the motions in them. And here you'll have to select the enemy idle instead. So click on the enemy idle. So now when you play your game, he will actually have his own idle animation. Okay, the same goes for the move animation. So go to the action stage and select the run. Go to the motion, click on the little radio button and find the run animation as well. There we go. So now he should be able to play his run animation. Besides that, there's an attack and throw animation, and let's just get them out of the way so we don't need to make them later. So go to your sprites, select your enemy and find the attack animation and drag them in to create the animation and call it enemy attack, and delete the controller. And then you can scroll down, take the enemy attack and drag it into the enemy folder under animations. And we also need to add the throw. So let's see if we can find it somewhere. It should be in the bottom here. Yeah, throw. Select all of the sprites, drag them into the scene and call it enemy throw. And then delete the two new sprites in your scene. Delete the new controller and find the animation and drag it into the enemy animations. Then we will have to go back to our enemy, select the animator window again, and then we will have to go to the action states, select throw, click on throw and select the enemy throw, click on attack, select motions and select the enemy attack. Okay, now when you've done this, remember to click file and save scene and file and save project, so that if you crash you don't have to set all this up again. So now we have an enemy with some different animations. So next thing we are going to do is to take a look at the actual structure of our enemy. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual structure that we are going to create. And as I told you earlier, we are going to make something called a state machine. Normally we will have a class called state machine, but in this case our enemy is actually going to be the state machine itself. And this enemy can go to some different states whenever he needs to attack or idle or just patrol back and forth. To create this state machine, we will have to use something called an interface. And an interface is basically some kind of contract between classes, and the interface defines all the functions that this class will need to implement. So we can make an interface that indicates every single function that the enemy should be able to execute, and this function or this interface should be implemented by every single state that the enemy has. I know this sounds very confusing, but I'm pretty sure it's going to make sense when we start making it. Okay, enough talking. Let's make some structure here. First of all, we have our interface, and the interface is going to be called enemy_state. It's always like that. When you create an interface in C#, you always name it with I in the beginning, so that you know it's an interface you're using when you're writing your code. It's also like that in .NET and everything when you just write C# code. So you'll always be able to recognize something that's an interface because it's named I as the first letter. So we need to define what kind of things or functions this interface needs to have. So the first function is void, and we're going to call it, let's just call it execute. So it needs a function called execute that returns void, and as you can see here, it's the other opposite syntax than it is in C#, and that's because this kind of diagram, UML diagrams, are not made for C#, they're made just for general programming, so they don't follow the C# syntax. Besides execute, we will need to have a enter function, and the enter function needs to take an enemy in called enemy, and we actually need to write it like this just to keep the syntax, and it returns nothing. So notice that I make a little plus here in the front, and that's because all the functions are public. Every single function in an interface is public by default, so we don't have to write public inside the function or inside the interface itself, but we will just indicate it here by the little plus. You'll also see that when we implement it. Besides that, we will need to make a exit function, and we call that just exit, and returns nothing. Okay, so let's explain these functions. First of all, we have the execute function. The execute function is the function that runs when the player is in the state. So let's say that we are in the patrol state where we need to move back and forth. Then the execute function makes sure that the player moves from left to right, not the player, the enemy moves from the left to the right. We have an enter function, and the enter function is called whenever the enemy enters a state, which means that in the patrol state, it will make sure that the enemy can move. It sets the speed to 1, for example. It sets his stats correctly. So everything we need to set up to make this state work will be executed in the enter function. Then we have our exit function, and the exit function is called whenever we exit the state. So let's say we are patrolling and we need to go back to idle. Well, then the exit state could, for example, set his speed to 0 so he doesn't move in idle, or it could move him to the idle animation instead. So that's what exit is. So these three functions is in each state. So each state can execute. What am I doing when I'm updating, basically? So the execute is kind of the update. It can enter, what do I need to do to prepare myself? And it can exit, what do I need to do to make sure that I didn't change some data that the other states are going to use. Besides these three, we will also need to make a trigger enter. So let's make a on trigger enter function, and it's called other, and it's collider 2D. There we go. So this on trigger enter function basically, and there's also a void. This onTriggerEnter function is called whenever we collide. So each state can have some different collisions, right? For example, when we patrol, we need to know when the platform ends. If a platform ends when we patrol, then we need to change direction. On the other hand, if I'm in an attack state and I collide with the player, then I need to attack him, for example. So this is our interface. So now that we have our interface, we can create the states. And the states are classes that implement this interface. And we will have 4 different states. We will have a state for attacking, a state for idling, a state for patrolling, and a state for throwing knives. Yes, that's what we need. So this state is called idle state, and it implements the interface like so. And then we have a melee, what should we call it? What did I call it? Melee state. So I'm just looking in my notes. And then I take this interface and I implement it like so. And we also have a ranged state. Just zoom out a little. And we have a patrol state. I think I added one too many states. So let's see, we have melee. Let's try to add these correctly. And we have our patrol state. And this arrow here just indicates that we implement all this interface. Just going to put it up here. Doesn't need to be nice, just needs to show. I'm just afraid that I'm going to put some things in front of my picture down here. Anyway, these are the states, and these states will each have all these functions in them, so that when the enemy implements it, he will be able to switch between these 4 states. So now that we have these states here, we can create our enemy. So we have an enemy class, and this enemy class has a private variable called current state, and it's of type enemy state. So he has the state here, and he will simply have a composition. So the enemy has a state inside him called enemy state. So he doesn't implement the interface. These classes implements it, and he just uses the interface from an instance here. So yes, this is basically the structure that we are going to create in our game. So I hope this will help you understand a little what we are creating. So we have all the 4 states here, which decide what the player should do. Here we melee attack, here we idle, here we patrol back and forth, here we throw a knife at the player. And the enemy has a state, and he can switch between these 4 states here. So we should start implementing the idle state, for example, and patrol state. So I hope this makes a little sense. So let's try to go to our game and implement some of it. Back in the Unity editor, you will have to open up your scripts folder, because in here we'll have to add a bunch of different scripts now. First of all, we'll have to add the enemy script. So right click, create a new C# script and name it enemy. When you have added that, we will need to add the states. And to make it more organized here, I have chosen to create a new folder. You don't need to do that, but I'm going to create a folder called enemy states. I'm going to right click, create folder, enemy states. And in here we'll have to add the states. First of all, we will need to add our interface, and we will create a script, a C# script class. And then when we open it up in Visual Studio or Mono Developer, we are going to change it into an interface. So right click, create C# script and call it enemy state. So this is our interface. We will need the 4 different states. So right click, create C# script, ranged state, create again a new C# script and call it a melee state. And the last state, or the two last states, is patrol and idle. So we make an idle state and a patrol state. There we go. So now we have all our states. First of all, open up the idle state. And let's just wait for it to open. There we go. And actually, I would like to go to our enemy state first. Sorry. First of all, delete start and update from them. And this is going to be an interface. So instead of public class, replace class with interface. Like so. Right now it inherits from mono behavior. That is not allowed. So just remove mono behavior and the colon after enemy state. Now we need to define the functions that this interface will need its children to implement. So, well, not children, but the class that implement this interface will need to implement these functions. So void execute. And remember, this is called an update on all states. We need to void enter. This is the one that is called when we switch into the state. And then we have void exit. And this is the one called when we exit the state, funny enough. And void on trigger enter. And it needs to take a collider 2D and call it other. And the enter state also need to take in an enemy. So write enemy here, so that when we enter, the state knows which enemy it controls and which enemy it needs to move around or make jump or whatever. So now we have defined what each state needs to do. So let's jump back to our melee state. Here our melee state is, and right now our melee state is inheriting from mono behavior, and that's not what we want to do. We want it to inherit from or implement the interface enemy state. So replace mono behavior with enemy state and delete start and update. As you can see here, it makes a squiggy red line, and the reason that it makes that line is because we haven't implemented all the functions from the interface. Because remember, an interface is a contract that says that this class that implements the interface needs to implement all these functions here. And as you can see in the interface, we created some functions without a body and without an access out here, because every single function here is public by default, and an interface can't contain functionality. It just defines some functions you need to implement. So that's why there's no body to these functions. So what were we at? It was the melee state. So basically we can do this. You can right click on the enemy state, click quick actions, and click on the implement interface function. And then it implements all the functions, and it shows non-squiggy red line here. So all these functions here has a throw non-implemented exception because we haven't implemented them yet. But just delete all these functions because we don't need them. And we have to do the exact same thing for the other states. So go to the idle state and implement enemy state, right click on it, quick action, implement interface, delete start and update, and delete that throw non-implemented exception in every single function here. Do the same for the patrol state. Enemy state, right click, implement. And if you can't implement it, you can write these yourself. That's also an option. But I think mono developer also can do this. And what else? We need range state, enemy state, delete these two, right click, quick actions, implement. Okay, and I think that was it, wasn't it? Idle, melee, patrol and ranged. There we go. Okay. So now we have implemented all our states. Before we end this video, we can jump to our enemy. In the top here, we can write private enemy state and call it current state. So this is the enemy's current state, and this current state can be idle state, melee state, patrol state, or a range state. But we'll look at that in the next video. So I'm going to end this video here. Remember that if you haven't done it already, like my Facebook page, follow me on Twitter, and subscribe to this channel. And if you like my tutorials and you want to support me, then please don't hesitate to do so by either acquiring this project or any of my other projects, or going to the Patreon page. If you go to the Patreon page, you will also be able to get some different perks. So you can also click that link to see what you can get there. For example, all my projects or some private tutoring. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.